Hi, I'm Michael Frye, and welcome to the second segment of my two videos about Lightroom 4. Now, in the first part, I talked about how the new tools in the basic panel work, and in this second section, I'm going to talk about how to use those tools, give you suggestions for how best to take advantage of the new capabilities in this process. Now, if you haven't watched that first segment, I recommend that you do so because it will help you understand how these tools work and what I'm doing in this video. So in this part 2, I'm going to talk about default settings, what I think might be a good starting place and what I'm using with the new process. And I'll also get into what tools you might want to use with the new process. Is it better to use the basic sliders or the point curve? And if you are going to use the basic sliders, what order is best? Now let's start by talking about default settings. Now if you've read my ebook Light and Land, or if you've watched some of my previous videos, you know that in the old process with Lightroom 3, the 2010 process, I preferred starting with everything at 0 and the point curve linear. Now, as I talked about in the last video, the default settings have changed, or really the numbers have changed, but the defaults are actually the same. In the new process, the defaults are all at 0 here, and the point curve is at linear. But those are actually equivalent to the old defaults of plus 50 brightness and plus 25 contrast, 5 blacks, and the medium contrast point curve. Now let's start here by talking about blacks. I never minded the old default of a plus 5 in the blacks. Mainly I set that at 0 because I started with everything else at 0, and I figured I may as well. And especially since I was probably going to set a black point with a point curve anyway. In the new process, it seems to work better to keep the blacks at Adobe's defaults, which in this case is 0. Equivalent of the old 0 is plus 25 here. But it just seems to work better in the new process to start with blacks at 0. And maybe that's because of the way that in the new process it automatically sets a black point. I think that's sort of calibrated to start with blacks at 0, and starting with blacks at 0 seems to give better depth and contrast to the shadows than starting with blacks at plus 25. As for the point curve, again, this linear curve actually has sort of the old medium contrast curve baked into it, and if we want to see what the old linear curve looked like, we have to make this sort of weird reverse S-curve with a whole bunch of points. You can see that that did reduce contrast a little bit, so there's a little bit of contrast baked into what's now the linear curve. And we also see that we have a little bit better shadow detail and highlight detail without that extra baked in contrast, and especially without the sort of the dip in the shadows that medium contrast, now linear curve gives you. However, that truly linear curve with all these points is a very impractical starting point. It's very difficult to manipulate a curve like this. And having a little bit more contrast is not terrible. I'm probably going to add contrast to most images, even high contrast images like this anyway. And if I want to sort of counteract that dip in the shadows that this new curve gives us, I can always push this shadow slider to the right, which works very well in the new process. So I'm starting with blacks at 0 and the point curve linear. Now as far as exposure and contrast, I'm starting with those at the equivalent of the old zeros, which is exposure at -1 and contrast at -33. With high contrast images, having this contrast set at 0 gives a little bit of a boost in contrast, and I like to see the contrast that I really have, or actually the shadow detail and highlight detail that I really have. So you can see that by taking that out, setting this at the equivalent of the old 0, which is minus 33, I have better highlight and shadow detail. Now, it looks a little bit flatter, but at least I can see sort of what I've really got there. And I've already got, some added contrast down here, so I don't want any more up here. Also, with many images, I think it's better to add contrast by setting a black point and white point to start with, rather than boosting midtone contrast, which is what this slider does and what the default setting does. Now, as far as this exposure setting goes, let me show you a couple of other images. And this is a photograph of Half Dome at Adobe's standard defaults with everything at 0 here in the new process. Now, judging by the histogram, the exposure looks right, but this isn't the way I remember this scene looking. I remember seeing a lot more color here. It was close to sunset, and Half Dome up here looks a little bit washed out. Let me show it to you a little bit bigger. It looks a little bit washed out. Just sort of lacking in contrast. If we take out the boost in the midtones that this default exposure setting gives, then, well, that looks more like I remember. Lots of color in here, even more blue in here, plus more contrast and snap and separation in these lighter tones. So again, what's happening when you push that exposure slider to the right, or even at the default setting of 0, is you're boosting the midtones. And as you do that, you steepen the curve in the bottom half of the image in the shadows. That increases contrast in the shadows, but you flatten the curve in the upper half, which flattens and reduces contrast in the highlights. And that's why the colors and contrasts look a little washed out in the highlights here. Now, this isn't a unique case. There are many images that kind of suffer from this boost in midtones that the default exposure setting gives. Here's another one, Horsetail Fall in Yosemite. And the amazing thing about Horsetail Fall when it gets this light in February is that there's this little strip of water lit by the setting sun, and everything around it is dark. But here, everything around it doesn't look so dark, and the color looks kind of washed out. If we change that exposure setting to -1, equivalent of the old 0 brightness, then, well, that's the way I remember this looking, with the rock around it dark and the waterfall a brilliant color and standing out cleanly from its surroundings. Now, it's not just colors that can be impacted by this boost in the midtones. Here's an almost a black and white image, and it looks a little washed out up in here. We take out that boost in the midtones in exposure, set that to -1, and you see better texture and contrast in the water. Now, there are some images that benefit from that boost in midtones. I think this is one of them. If I take this down to -1, well, it just looks very dark. Everything's pushed over here to the left. And this is actually an image that I think, starting with that little boost in the midtones, might be a good thing. There really is no ideal starting place that's going to work best for every image, right? The ideal starting place would be the place we'd end up after we'd processed every image for an hour. If we could import every image into Lightroom and it would just look perfect, just the way we want it to look after we'd spent a lot of time with it, then that would be great. And of course, we wouldn't need videos like this. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. and we have to pick some starting place. If you prefer to keep the Adobe defaults, just remember that with a lot of images, it might be a good idea to start by pushing that exposure slider to the left, as we did here, and maybe brighten the image another way, like by setting the white point to start with if you do need to brighten it. Now let's look at processing a couple of different images here in the new process in Lightroom 4. And I'm going to talk about processing both lower contrast images and high contrast images. So we'll start with a lower contrast image, or at least one where I want to increase contrast rather than decrease it. Now if you've read my Light and Land ebook, you know that in the old process with Lightroom 3, I preferred using the point curve over using the basic sliders. And I had a lot of reasons for doing that. I felt that there were some things lacking in the basic sliders, just some things that I couldn't do. In the new process, the basic sliders I think are much better, a much more viable option. Now does that mean I'm going to abandon using the point curve? No, not very likely. There's still a degree of precision I can get with a point curve that I can't quite get with the basic sliders. But having said that, the new sliders are so much better that most of the time, 90% of the time, I can make the image look exactly the same either way, either with the basic sliders or with the point curve. And it's not an either or thing, right? You can use curves on one image and the sliders on another, or actually even use them both in the same image. In the old process, I used recovery and fill light all the time along with the point curve. And in the new process, I'm using highlights and shadows along with the point curve frequently. And there's all kinds of other ways you could mix and match as well. The good news is that I know there are a lot of people who don't feel comfortable using the point curve. And since the new basic sliders have improved so much, that's going to make it easier for many people to just get better results from their images more easily. And I think that's a great thing. Now I'm going to set this image to, to my new defaults here. That does make it look rather dark, but we're going to fix that. Now if you're going to use the basic panel sliders here, Adobe suggests that you use them from top to bottom, starting with exposure, then going to contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Now this order, kind of starting with the middle, right, and then moving out to the ends, contradicts a long-standing tradition in digital imaging of starting with the ends, of setting the black point and the white point first. Now I'm not the kind of person who's just going to stand on tradition because, hey, we've always done it that way. If there's a better way of doing it, great. But I do think that there are some good reasons why setting the white and black points to start with works. Starting by moving the white point and black point, if there's room to do so without clipping highlights or shadows, increases contrast throughout the image and doesn't flatten highlights or shadows. And I think you'll be able to see what I mean with this photograph. So again, this is kind of dark, and if you were to start with exposure here, probably your first move would be to push that to the right to make the image lighter. In fact, I think you might end up somewhere around there, around the Adobe default of 0. Once again, as I talked about, that boosts the midtones and kind of flattens out the highlights, and the highlights here, a very important part of this image, look a little bit flat and washed out. So I'm going to set this exposure back to -1 and start instead by moving the white slider to the right to set a white point. And I'm going to hold down the Option key, which lets me see highlight clipping there, and just back off so that there's no clipping. Okay, plus 63. And let me show you the difference here. Okay, so here was starting by pushing the exposure slider to the right, and here's starting by moving the white slider to the right. And in this case, I like this a lot better. You know, there's more contrast. The highlights don't look washed out. We see great sort of local contrast and separation up here, especially these sunbeams cutting through the water stand out better. All in all, I think that's a better start. So let me, show you a rough equivalence here with the point curve. Okay, so I'll set that back. By pushing the exposure slider to the right, again, we're boosting midtones and consequently kind of flattening out highlights. By moving the white slider to the right, we're actually doing something kind of like this. Moving the white point over, and maybe a little bit of a boost there, kind of anchors the shadows a bit. But you can see that the line of the curve is quite steep up here in the midtones and highlights, and so we've actually increased contrast in those vital areas of this photograph and yet lightened it at the same time. All right, let me go back to where I was with the white slider there. Okay, that actually looks a little bit different, but you get the idea. Now with this image, I probably wouldn't move the black slider. If I hit the J key, I can see that there's already some pure black here. And I think I do want that here. I like that in this image. I like this to be contrasty, but I don't think I need any more. So after setting the whites and blacks, I'm going to go back up to exposure and contrast. I think I'll leave exposure as it is for now. I might want to push contrast to the right a bit, add just sort of some more mid-tone contrast, a little bit of an S-curve. I probably wouldn't do anything with the highlights or shadow sliders. I use those more for higher contrast images to bring down highlights or boost shadows. Here I'm trying to increase contrast. So anyway, I think that looks pretty good. That has the the kind of the contrast and snap and depth that I'd like to see in this photograph. Now let me show you how I would do the rough equivalent with the point curve. So I'm going to set this back to my new defaults here. Start again by setting a white point, and I'll hit the J key to show the clipping, and I'll just move it until there's no clipping. Just back off from that slightly. Okay. Then I would do the equivalent of what I did with the contrast slider here, which is to make a bit of an S-curve. In this case, I'm going to start by pulling down a point about a quarter of the way up the curve, like that, kind of deep in the shadows, and then maybe take a point about 3/4 of the way up and push it up and to the right just a little. That increases the mid-tone contrast and brightens things back up a little bit. And I can play with this shadows point here, this 1/4 point, just to see how dark do I want the shadows to be. Do I want them really dark? Do I want them maybe a little bit more open? Let's say, somewhere around there. That's one of the things I like about using the point curve, is just that degree of precision to adjust these points independently, kind of a highlight and shadow point. You can sort of do the same thing with the highlights and shadow sliders here. I could push shadows to the left. It doesn't work quite the same way, and I prefer doing that kind of stuff with the point curve. But we can compare what I did here with the curve to what I did with the basic sliders, starting with whites. And there was the basic sliders, there was the point curve. Boy, pretty similar, right? And in fact, I'm sure I could tweak one or the other to look almost exactly the same. But the key was starting with the exposure reduced and moving the white point so that we got good separation and contrast in the highlights. Now, having just shown you a demonstration of why sometimes it's better to set a white point or a black point or both rather than move the middle with the exposure slider, on most images it doesn't really matter. In fact, I think 90% of the time when I've tried processing an image starting by setting the white and black points or starting in the middle with the exposure slider, I've ended up essentially at the same place. Probably the situations where it makes the biggest difference are images like this, where the image is a little bit underexposed and you want to lighten it but keep good local contrast in the highlights. All right, let's go back and look at that first photograph, a higher contrast image. Now I'm going to set this to my new defaults. You can see that when I reduced the exposure to -1, it provided better contrast in the highlights up in El Capitan here. Here was with exposure at 0. This looks kind of washed out up here. With exposure at -1, this looks a lot better, but the shadows don't look as good. The shadows now, here as before, nice open shadows. Now they look rather dark and muddy. With high contrast images, you often kind of have to compromise, at least to start with. You'd really like a different exposure, different brightness for different parts of the image. Using the basic sliders for a high contrast image like this, I actually like using the Adobe suggested order, starting with the exposure slider. So here I'm going to compromise and set something more or less halfway in between Adobe's 0 default and my preferred default of -1. So that starts to wash out the highlights a little bit, but not too much, and we have better, more open shadows. Now I'm going to leave the contrast at -33. I don't think I want any more contrast at this point, and go straight to the highlights and shadows sliders. So I'll move highlights to the left to bring down those brighter tones. Boy, that's already much better. One of the things I love about this new highlight slider is that you can darken highlights like this and yet still keep good contrast, separation. I know I'm kind of like a broken record about this stuff, but obviously it's very important to me. So, it doesn't look flat up here, which could happen with the recovery slider in the old process. Now I'm going to push shadows to the right to give us a bit more shadow detail, maybe something like that. I think that already looks much better. As far as white point and black point, I don't have much room to move the white point without getting some clipping, probably right in there. I think pushing the shadows to the right, I've probably lost any pure blacks that I might have had. Yeah, I think so. So I'm going to maybe take the blacks down just a little bit to have just a touch of pure black somewhere in the photo. I think in a dramatic scene like this, that a little bit of black helps to give it more drama. Now I might also want to go back and add just a little bit of mid-tone contrast here. That helps almost every image. And maybe I'll play with the exposure. I might want to just lighten that overall just a touch, maybe like that. And then the main thing left to do here is to lighten up the reflections down here, which I would do with either the graduated filter tool or the adjustment brush. Now using the point curve, I would start by doing something similar. Start by boosting the midtones a bit. In this case, I'll use a kind of a 3/4 point to do that because I know I'm going to go there anyway. And then maybe, just add a little bit of that midtone contrast again because I know I'm going to do that. Then I would go straight to the highlights and shadow sliders, bring those highlights down as I did before, and boost the shadows, maybe something like that. I might, again, tweak the black point just a bit, maybe just a little bit brighter and a little bit more contrast, something like that. And again, I would want to lighten that reflection with the graduated filter or adjustment brush. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to processing images in Lightroom than I can show you in this video. We haven't looked at most of the other tools over here in the Develop module. And we've only looked at decision making for a couple of different images. The best way to learn more about processing images in Lightroom is to take a workshop. And of course, I do workshops that are specifically focused on Lightroom, as well as workshops that combine field work with processing those images in Lightroom. And I also do private workshops, which can be about Lightroom or any other subject that you want. Of course, you can find out more about my workshops at michaelfrye.com. I'm also working on some online training materials about Lightroom, so if you stay tuned to my blog, you'll hear more about those. As always, I really appreciate your taking time out of your busy day to spend some time with me and learn more about photography. So thanks very much for watching.